record to the cloud. Okay. So we have been
I just wanted to
starting the Torah portion of Vayakel a few different times, but over the holidays it's been start and stop. So I think that it can just briefly review the beginning of Vayakel and get into the Hasidic insights. I don't believe we did the first one at the bottom of the page of 270, although we discussed some of the concepts. So Vayakel is a Torah portion, where Vayakel and Pekudei go to the last two Torah portions of the second book of the Torah, the book of Exodus. It brings to a close the second book of the Torah. Most of the book, the beginning of the book of the second book, is about the Exodus, the freedom from Egypt, the trip to Sinai, getting the Torah, and then afterwards, not going in order of exactly how the Torah lays it out, but in the chronological historical order, we have 40 days after Moshe brings the 40 days after after the revelation at Sinai, Hashem speaks to the Jews at Sinai, and Moshe goes up the mountain for 40 days. So 40 days later, he comes down with tablets, and he sees that the Jews have created a golden calf. He smashes the tablets, and then once everything is settled, he begs God for another chance. And so he goes up the mountain, and then Hashem tells him, okay, and he has to come to the mountain a third time for another 40 days. But, as we had mentioned, the first time he went up the mountain, just him, as far as we know. Certainly did not bring up any sculpting tools or stone with him, and came down with the stones engraved by God. It says that very clearly in the Torah. And then, when Hashem tells him to come back up, he says, bring with you stone. The engraving will be by God, but the stone, basically the stuff of the Ten Commandments, is going to be supplied by human being, Moshe. And when he comes down the mountain, that with the second tablets, which is on Yom Kippur, then now we have been restored into that Torah relationship with Hashem. Yom Kippur has that resonance, for posterity, time of restoring our relationship with ourselves, with each other, with God, who we need to be. And the day afterwards, Hashem tells him to build the tabernacle. The day after Yom Kippur, the 11th day of Tishrei, and that is really a lot of the second half of the second book of the Torah is about the tabernacle, what was done, and what needed to be done, and the service done in there. Now, these last Torah portions, as I've mentioned, is really almost like a review, and we read a bit about that, of what went into building the tabernacle. So it's not scintillating screenplay here, but it's here for a reason. The details are here for a reason. We spoke about that. We read about that, I think, the last time or the last two times we've met. But the Torah portion does start off with a little bit of a narrative, and saying that Hashem tells Moshe to gather the Jews, to talk to them about the tabernacle. And one of the things he says is that even as important as building the tabernacle is, don't build it on Shabbos. Shabbos has its rhythm, and even doing really good stuff is not, if it's externally creative, that's not for Shabbos work. Shabbos is we turn inwards, and more of an inner creativity, which we're not going to deal with right now. We've spoken about it a couple of times, and we'll probably touch on it again in the coming weeks a little bit as we work our way forward. The first Hasidic insight here focuses on the conceptual difference between the first tablets and the second tablets. And it's not just a difference in tablets. and difference between, there's obviously some type of difference in quality. One was given by God in entirety. One is kind of a partnership of, we bring the stone, God gives the content. But it's also a difference, a very important difference in our psycho-spiritual standing. When we stood at Sinai, the way that we were freed, and actually the word for inscribing, which God inscribed, engraving, which God engraved the Ten Commandments on the Torah, on the tablets. The word is charut or charus, and which is very similar to the word cherus, which could be exactly, depending on the vowelization. Cherus means freedom, and the idea that Hashem engraved these cosmic ideas of Torah on a physical stone tablet is representative of the idea of having that, of how the impact of this gift on us, in that it was engraved on us. Something engraved is different than something written, in the sense that it's there. You know, even a flood's not going to take away those words. It's very it becomes part and parcel. The words are not an overlay. The ink, ultimately on a piece of paper, is ultimately, it's a second layer. There's the paper, the substance, and then you put something on top of it. When we engrave, there's no overlay. We're taking the substance itself and within the substance creating those letters. So the idea of engraving is something that the Jewish spirituality and Talmud and Kabbalah find very profoundly instructive, in this idea that Torah was engraved on us. Standing at Sinai became part and parcel of who we are. It wasn't an overlay, so to speak. And that in and of itself freed us. As I said, Chorus and Cherus, the idea of freedom, standing at Sinai, the awareness, the experience, the connection with God lifted us above the normal static that comes with being human and having a self-centered ego and the things that we all have to deal with. In the words of the Talmud, it reversed, the Sinai experience reversed the effects of the Garden of Eden, of the mistake, the violation of Adam and Eve, or the Machava in the Garden of Eden. It really restored us to a very spiritually pristine place. So that's dealing with that Torah. When Moshe brought down the first tablets, obviously we messed up. So as Adam and Eve did, but the setting was the idea of a gift, a divine gift, a purely divine gift to saintly people. That was the setting. When Moshe brought down the second tablets, he brought down earthly stone with divine concepts embedded by God, but he brought the setting was a human. It was giving it to a people who are human, who made a tremendous mistake, who are obviously open to mistakes and had recognized the mistake and gotten back on the horse. So in the general rhythm of how Torah sees different avenues in life, and it's something that is sometimes subtly, but is kind of a recurrent theme in Jewish spirituality, is that there's two avenues. There's the avenue of what we call the tzaddik, the perfectly righteous, which are few and far between. And then there's what we call the Baal Teshuvah, us, people who have the struggle of humanity, of the human personality. God gave us that struggle. Most of us, we can't choose to escape that struggle. the idea of again, the self-centeredness or the lack of prioritization or whatever the things that go on in our lives. And we have to struggle to find moral and mental clarity and to be able to bring holiness into our lives. The two avenues. Yeah, Debbie, you had a question? Yeah. Yeah.
So I hadn't heard the thought about the first tablets kind of being analogous to getting us back to the level of the Garden of Eden. And I do like the contrast between the two sets, but it brought to mind well, a comment and a question. One is that how appropriate that it's like I didn't realize that mean that the apple is somewhat analogous to the golden calf, because that's the two mistakes we did to bring us down. Yeah. And then secondly, is that suggesting that if we didn't do the golden calf, that we would have been kind of back in the Garden of Eden, or that just spiritual?
It's if the Garden of Eden, yes. See, this is a struggle I've had for decades. It's like, what would life have been if they hadn't made that mistake? By the way, the apple thing is you're hard pressed to find actually a Torah source that was an apple. Just throwing out it's
fruit or whatever.
Yeah, for fruit and etc. Yeah, it was something. It's there's an opinion in the Talmud of a stalk of wheat, whatever it was, but they ate something they weren't supposed to eat. So there is I think one is hard pressed to imagine what kind of world would have been meaningful to God if there had not been that mistake in the Garden of Eden. And because the Garden of Eden was a place, but it was really a state of mind. It was a state of being. The Garden of Eden is right here, right where you are right now. It's being able, but imagine that you're sitting in your house and you look around and you can see the divine purpose in everything. And that doesn't happen. But if you could, that you would be living in the Garden of Eden. Now, let me take a very, not just a really good person, but those really few and far between saintly spiritual masters, when they're sitting at home. I've never been one, but I can tell you that based on what we study, when they look around and they see the kitchen table and they see the refrigerator and see whatever they see clearly God's purpose in what's sitting in front of them. It's not that they have to bring their mind there. That's where they are. It's like a person born with perfect pitch. That's just where they are. So the idea of what would have been if not for the golden calf, yes, we would have been in a very different, much more purely spiritual and holy place, and without a lot of the challenges we have. Now, what would have been the purpose of life? We can talk about that one time. I've pulled and pushed this for decades, just like get something a little more concrete. I can tell you a little bit, but it's not in a way that actually resonates with me enough to be able to make something out of it. To me, it's quite clear that God got exactly what God wanted, which is what we have here. And that's why Adam and Eve were kind of set up where it couldn't be their choice, but the conditions were set up where they were very likely to make that choice, and they did. And similarly with the golden calf, as the Talmud says very clearly, that the Jews were better than this. They were above this the idea of creating golden calf, but God wanted them to have this taste of what teshuvah is. So the answer to your question, Debbie, by the book is definitely yes, they would have been different. It would have been holy. Is that what God really wanted? I don't think so. Yes, Barbara, you're asking. You're muted, Barbara.
If each of us are responsible for our own behavior, those who putting the Garden of Eden aside for a moment, with the golden calf, which you're relating to it, the Jews who weren't killed at Mount Sinai, they didn't participate in the golden calf. Their eyes observed it. Right. Aaron himself realized that if he tried to stop it, he himself would have been killed. Why are we responsible? The Jews appropriately reacted. If Aaron is supposed to be the leader, following his stead, those who remained didn't commit that crime. Why should we be penalized for those who had the ultimate punishment, death, waiting for the
think
Messiah to come?
I think that there are two things. It's just as Adam and Eve made a mistake. Why is it our problem? Because
No, but I didn't deal with Adam and Eve because I haven't thought of that. I'm thinking only about the golden calf.
No, I understand, but I'm saying that I think that there's an analogy to be drawn. That Adam and Eve did it, so why is it my problem? Why it's my problem is because that's part of my soul consciousness now. They brought it to the world. When the language of the Talmud itself, actually, if you want to just, the verbiage is that when there's a Hebrew word, or it's actually Aramaic, zoma, which means it's like a certain contamination, maybe, but like a soul contamination, an ego. So it says that when the Jews stood at Sinai, the contamination that had persisted with humanity from the time of Garden of Eden left them, and when they created the golden calf, they brought that contamination back to the world, not to themselves, to the world. They brought it back into society. And especially if we as Jews, I'm not talking about the world, if we as Jews are fundamentally one organism, if this is what's going on with our people, and we sit or stand on Yom Kippur and we talk about different things, we don't say I did this wrong, I did that wrong. I say we say we did, because there is definitely the collective, and we benefit from the collective, and we're responsible for the collective, and therefore, I mean, I'm okay with that answer. I don't know how you feel about it, but that is certainly seems to be the case. It was not about individuals, although some individuals can be able to get beyond this, that type of. I don't. I want to tell you something else. Also, I think we're not even going to get into the text again today, but something that some of you probably have heard from me that I think is an important insight in helping us understand this is that. And I'll try and make it short, but they Ger Rebbe. Ger is a very large Hasidic stream, and after the war, Ger moved its center. They came from Europe. They were decimated. They came to Israel, and as the story is told, that one of the refugees, having lost his entire family, he came to Israel, and he heard he had been a Ger Chassid a Ger follower in Europe, and now he came to Israel and he heard that I was there, and he came to the Rebbe and he started to cry. He said, "How can we continue? How can we continue? How after what we just went through, what we just saw?" And he said the Rebbe cried with him, and the Ger Rebbe cried with him, and then pointed to a verse in the Torah, which is actually in Deuteronomy, but it's about Moses recapping to the Jews what happened when he broke the tablets. And there, the language of the Torah is, I came down the mountain, the tablets, I saw what you were doing, and I broke the tablets before your eyes. So the Ger Rebbe said, "What do you mean before your eyes? Why is that? It's not, I broke them." And so what Moshe was saying is, I broke them as far as our reality of what you can see. But at some level, the tablets are still whole, and we not only do we need to believe it, we need to be able to tap into that. In Chabad Hasidic thought, there is the idea that for truly righteous people, the temple was actually never destroyed, because they're looking at reality differently. Obviously, the building's not there, but the shifts in reality. So the idea that the collective, me and you, we all, the world, reabsorbed that kind of funky, schmutz perception, where we're not seeing with such a pristine spiritual clarity. That's true, but there are people who can rise above it, and those are the rare types of individuals that we call it tzaddik. You're muted again, sorry. What?
Your analysis, which is spiritual,
Yeah.
when you look at Mount Sinai, it shows a sense of realness, being in the real world versus Moses coming down from the spiritual. One of the reactions one could get looking at Moses is his rage. Now I understand
His range
rage,
or rage?
having
Okay.
seen what he saw.
Okay.
But Aaron was down there. The fact he's high up on the mountain, Aaron is down there, right in the dirt, right down on earth, with a very important human trait. And the restraint that even Israel shows today when they're at war and their children are at risk of dying emulates that type of restraint where you try to be fair and equitable. And many people have difficulty with conduct. And looking at Mount Sinai, I think it just emulates Aaron's conduct, which is difficult to understand because could he have done something? Could he have stopped the golden calf? And trying to understand that concept of no, he could not. So he stood with those who didn't participate. But at the same token, he represents a certain type of restraint where you have to kind of mix the spirituality with a common sense reality. Most people react to rage, or they get rageful, and then their meaning is supposed to be understood. Aaron, on the other hand, doesn't react. He keeps his conduct restrained, so that he ends up standing as an example for everybody. I think it's an excellent way of going through life. And that concept often gets lost with the spirituality of what's understood as far as what the Torah means and, why the first Torah and the second Torah are really the same. The point is, Aaron, while all that's going up, Moses goes up, he gets the second Torah. Guess who's standing down there quelling the crowd? Aaron. And I think Israel represents a combination, or at least trying to represent, as long as Israel exists, because we're the only country in the world Israel is the only country in the world that I know of. I know in World War II, they sent notices, they did certain things in certain communities to clear it out, okay? But that concept has been really brought to its highest extent through the publicity as to what Israel is doing. And I think that's really an example of bringing the Torah, spirituality, and reality together. It's like creating a heaven on earth. And I think it's a lost concept here, because I think most people have a lot of difficulty dealing with their emotions and their reactions and believing that they're right. And all of that spirituality will never be Moses, but we have a chance to follow Aaron as an example.
Yeah, that's well said. Thank you. I think now let's try and get into the Hasidic insights. Bottom of 270. It says the differences between the first and second tablets. As was seen above, when the people received the Torah Mount Sinai, they were cleansed of the effects of any previous wrongdoings and restored to the spiritual status of Adam and Eve before they ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge, which is what I said before. They lost this status when they committed the sin of the golden calf. Thus, when God first gave the Torah, he gave the people the opportunity to live life in the way holy, righteous individuals live it. Afterwards, their approach to life became that of penitence. So we said before, we have these two tracks of a person really, and it's really a separate question also. So what's the purpose in life of someone who is a tzaddik, who doesn't have the challenges, who doesn't have to get past their rage, doesn't have to control themselves. But assuming that we can explain that there is a purpose to life, and there's usefulness, and there's personal growth even for such a person, there are two very different tracks. One is what we're dealing with, where we're swimming upstream, and then there's the perfectly righteous. So there are advantages in looking at each of these ways, concepts. There are advantages and disadvantages to both states of being, as was noted above. It was because of, and as was noted above, it was because of the opportunities available only to penitents that God orchestrated the sins involving the tree of knowledge and the golden calf in the first place. So, in other words, remember, God orchestrating I'm not disagreeing with what they're saying, but I think it's very, very subtle language. It's important. You know, I share that I was 25 years ago, 27 years ago, the first years I was here, when I was doing a lot of driving, I did a lot of, I had a lot of cassette tapes I would listen to in the car of different things. And there were few tapes I listened to of someone who was, some of you may know his names, I'm not going to mention him, but he's a pretty well noted Hasidic lecturer in English. And he had said that God really, that Adam and Eve, that the whole thing with the fruit, it was something they did on purpose, because they had to create a world of confusion. God wanted it, and they knew what God wanted, so they did it. So I actually, at that point, I was this thing has always fascinated me. So I was in Morristown. I went up to the study hall. There's a man who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. Suddenly, there's a tremendous genius who had so much of the entire Torah in his head, and specifically all of the Chabad Hasidic thought is very, very voluminous. So I went over to his table and I said, I mentioned this idea. I said, where does it say this in Chabad Hasidus? Because I heard it from a Chabad rabbi who's a knowledgeable guy. He was the kind of guy who he thought and said it doesn't say it anywhere, because he had that kind of mastery of it. So I said, I heard it from someone who knows what he's talking about. So he thought again. He says, doesn't say it anywhere. So then he said to me, who told it to you? So, I mean, this is not so relevant. I said the name. He said, he laughed. He said, well, he's his own source. You know, I don't, it's, if we don't, I can't tell you. Said, but to say that somehow this was not a mistake, that this was something that they did. If Adam and Eve didn't have human volition to do it, then there's no, by divine justice, how can you punish them and us? So when we say God orchestrated, and I think I try to be careful when I'm talking about it, and I was talking about it before, that God orchestrated a situation and conditions and variables, and even what we can call a perfect storm of variables, but he did not orchestrate their volition, their choice. And I just want to put that in there, that here God, but the idea is definitely there, and we were talking about it before, that God says orchestrated the sins involving the tree of knowledge of the golden calf in the first place, because God wanted us to live the world to be the world it is now, for us to battle with it, to wrestle with it, and find the meaning in it. Righteous people do not have to contend with the challenges of temptation. They can perform the divine mission naturally without impediments. And you could think about this, think about something that you would never do. And excuse the, if this is, I'm going off the track a little bit, but when I try to explain this to people, I say, think about something like pedophilia. To a healthy person, what, they're struggling with themselves not to do it? If a person wants to do it, there's something wrong with them, I think. So it's not, there are things that we naturally stay away from. It's not like, oh, I'd like to have, I'm hungry and I'm smelling the bacon and I can't do it. But, the idea is there, so it smells good. There, well, it doesn't even smell good. It doesn't even look good. There's no attraction. The righteous person looks at anything that is a counter to God's will as, I don't want it. Or maybe a little bit more of a genteel metaphor would be someone who has come to recognize that that French fries are really not good for his or her health, and therefore it doesn't seem them anything attractive anymore. So I don't even want it, and I see to myself actually as I grow older, certain things. I'm not talking about French fries, but other things. But other people say I just don't want it anymore. You don't have to struggle with yourself. You see in it something that's not good for you. You don't want it. So the righteous, the perfectly righteous, we're talking about, they look at something, they see it. There is no struggle because they see it as something that God has told them is poison for their souls. So there's not a scintilla of gravitational pull in that direction. So their lives are an ongoing process of realizing their own God-given potential and transforming the world around them into God's home. So this is a nice sentence trying to encapsulate. So what are these people doing? These God-given people. Their job is to try to bring more godliness to the world. Well, we're not going to get into that too much now. Penitence, however, which is us, whether we are actually penitents or not, but the idea is that we're the people struggling, have to exert themselves and tap reservoirs of inspiration and self-discipline that the righteous have no need of. Their lives are a process of striving beyond themselves, rectifying the previous wrongdoings, and they transform realms of reality that the righteous never touched. That's the reality. We all struggle with a level of ego and self-centeredness that's normal to us, but the perfectly righteous don't have to deal with. Because of those layers of personality, none of us is perfectly attuned in our actions or even necessarily in our thoughts. And therefore, if we're conscious, we have to work within ourselves and we have to dig deeper and we have to say, okay, how did I get there? Why did I do that? Why was I disrespectful to that person? Whatever the deal is. But there's a challenge, first of all, being conscious of what we did. There's a challenge of caring enough about what we did to want to correct it. And then there's a challenge of digging deeper in ourselves to actually do some behavior modification, which is not an easy thing. In that sense, the righteous, they don't have to deal with it. I don't know this as a fact, but it's a story that I've heard a number of times, and the details always seem to be the same. So I'm going to bet it's correct that a young man from Belgium came to the Rebbe, and he went by the Rebbe used to give out dollars to people to give to charity, a blessing. And this young man said to the Rebbe, I'm engaged to get married to a non-Jewish woman. And he's sharing that with the Rebbe. I don't think it wasn't. It was like, I think he was sharing his dilemma. And what I'm told, usually these are on video, but I haven't seen any video. Told us that the Rebbe said, "I'm jealous of you." I said, "Why are you jealous?" He said, "Because I've never had to struggle, with, to have such a struggle central to my life." And there's a point to that, that we all we're in different situations, and God knows that very well, and that we're for us to find a meaning, a beauty within our situation. And most of us can't just remake our lives so easily, but we can find a meaning and we can make changes and choices. That's very special. But the perfectly righteous don't usually have that kind of are not usually. That's really not part of their program. So there is a very powerful value to the life we lead. In the words of the Talmud, that the person who has made changes, what we call a Baal Teshuvah, but that doesn't mean necessarily a person who has totally changed their lives over into everything, but that they have looked at an area of their lives and they are upgrading it and modifying their behavior. So the language of the Talmud, the perfectly righteous cannot stand in the environs, in the same place as a person who has persevered in that struggle. So the Talmud itself says that there's an advantage to the second one, and Torah sees it, and clearly that's something from us. The way we look at Torah, that's what God wanted from us, to be able to struggle and be able and find our bearings. Now, at the same time, obviously, someone perfectly righteous, you look and say, "Wow, you're amazing! You're a conduit for godliness to the world." That's true, but there's the balance of the advantages and where they fit in to God's design. So if you look at the second paragraph here, in the second column, essentially then, the difference between righteous people and penitents is that the former work with their God-given gifts and with those aspects of reality that are a priori fit to become God's own, while the latter work with their own powers in the realms of reality that are initially antithetical to divinity. And again, certainly, I know plenty of people who spend different times of their lives doing things that that the Torah wouldn't have had them do, but at this point, they look at the value of Torah in a different way. They bring that knowledge with them of a world that isn't a Torah world, and it helps amplify their Torah observance. It helps them impact others also. If again, I know this from my own life and my own friends and my own colleagues. If I'm sitting with someone who's going through a spiritual struggle that I have never had, I can be a friend and I can be a rabbi and do my best. If I'm sitting with a friend who has been through that struggle, that came out the other side, and is talking about how the world works Torah-wise, it's just going to be that much more effectiveness because they know the experience. They're truly relating to it. So the struggle itself can become a tool for goodness, a tool for holiness. And those who just never step out of line, those who never or who haven't done any violations, they can talk about it conceptually, but there's something missing in the body of their message to the person who's going through the struggle themselves. This difference was reflected in the two sets of tablets. According to the sages, if the first tablets had not been broken, the people would have never forgotten any part of the Torah they learned. Okay, so this is something where it's the way the Talmud puts it is that it's not just a difference between one set of tablets, the second set of tablets, or even a difference in the substance of where they got the stone from. They were totally different, the concepts. They're totally different gifts. If they're standing at Sinai, if we had not gone through with the golden calf, and Moses had come down with those 10 commandments, there was more of Torah to be had. 10 commandments are just 10 commandments. We have 613 commandments. We would have gotten the entire Torah. We would have gotten the book of Joshua also, the Talmud tells us. But it would have been with a clarity that would have been engraved in us. And again, the engraving means that there's a perpetuity and a clarity, and that therefore there's no, excuse me, they would never have forgotten. Now, we all forget. So, but I think talk about forgetting in Jewish spiritual thinking, it's you might one could look at some things and say it's like forgetting is like it's like a sin. Like, well, we forget. It says that you didn't do something wrong by forgetting. But first of all, there's some things you don't forget, right? And maybe you'd say, how could you forget? And there's some things that are engraved on us. There's some things that there's just a clarity of who we are. How could we forget? Right? I'm never going to forget my parents and my kids, God forbid. I mean, unless there's an illness. I'm not going to, I mean, I unfortunately forget much more than I'm comfortable with. But if I want to make sure to remember something, I engrave it. I write it down. I have a list from the day sitting right next to me where they're writing it down itself. I don't even have to look at the list usually because it engraves it in my mind. So the idea of what we would have received at Sinai, it was a conceptually different Torah. Again, as the Talmud, and even more so in spiritual writing. So what it's saying is that we would not, our relationship with the Torah is different. There would have been a clarity where we would not have to sit and argue and mine the Torah, which is what we all do, right? And it's beautiful. We do it in yeshivas, or who would need yeshivas? It would be, Torah would be clear. The message would be clear. We never saw such a thing. Anybody on this in the world in the past few thousand years has not experienced such a thing, where the Torah is just totally clear. It would have been, and expressions that it wouldn't have been forgotten. It would have been engraved in us. The second tablets did not affect reality this way. Thus, the people would now have to exert themselves in order to retain the Torah they learned. So, the Torah that the second tablets represents the Torah we have, where we have to figure out, first of all, to read. You have to understand what we're reading. Then we got to see how it makes sense to us. Then we're going to ask the questions. Then we're going to compare it to other things, and we go through. It's a lifetime of learning, and we don't even get through it all, because we're digging deeper and trying to get to the core messages and to distill them and get clarity there. Imagine if all of a sudden there's just clarity. It's I mean, it's beautiful. I'm sure there would be plenty of Torah, but it would not be with the struggle. Although this clarity puts us at a disadvantage, this clearly puts us at a disadvantage vis-a-vis how broader knowledge of Torah can be. It nonetheless affords us the opportunity to delve deeper into the Torah than we would have otherwise. As in other contexts, the depths we can reach when we exert ourselves and muster our own hidden potential are greater than those we can reach when we receive God's revelation as a gift. And I want to make a note of where we are, because I want to start remembering that. We have, I think, as an illustration of this, there are two Talmuds. So just to get it clear, we had something orally given to us by Moses. The Jews taught that only verbally. That we did not have. There were little teachers would keep handwritten notes, but there was nothing published. There was no public record on papyrus, nothing of the oral interpretations, only of the Torah that we have, the book, the scroll we take out of the ark. That went on for over 1,000 years. And in the 2nd century, a man known as Rabbi Judah the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Anossi, he saw it as necessary for reasons that are beyond this conversation now, but he was a person of tremendous spiritual gravity, and also happened to have the means to be able to. He was a very wealthy man, and connected with the Roman government, friendly with Marcus Aurelius, and he and the rabbi decided, but he led the team, decided to write down the oral law. That's what's called the Mishnah. After the Mishnah, later generations, for a couple of hundred years, they start to unpack it. Now, by that time, because of the Roman persecution, the Jewish community had shifted a lot to Babylonia. So Babylonia had become like in America of its time. And Israel was actually not an Israel of our time. Israel became steadily weaker. So while there was still, for hundreds of years, there was a Torah center, and Israel was Israel. Israel was always going to be Israel. And therefore there was great respect given to the rabbis of Israel. The caliber of study and the level, and even the level of freedoms to be able to study was different. So there are two Talmuds. The Mishnah is always the same, but for the later rabbis who debated and unpacked the Mishnah, there's something we call the Jerusalem Talmud. That's really not. It wasn't Jerusalem. It was Israel. And it was more in the north. It was Tiberias, but the rabbis unpacked it in Israel, and then the rabbis unpacked it in Babylonia. So we call it. There's been for thousands of years two Talmuds in the Jewish community: Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi, the Babylonian Talmud, and Talmud of Israel. The Talmud that we study in yeshivas, the Talmud that is used as the definitive source for Jewish law and direction, is the Babylonian Talmud. Jerusalem Talmud is the Talmud. It's obviously very, it's holy, and but it's. I mean, it's studied, usually for footnotes, and actually Ger studies it in yeshiva, but that's not, it's Talmud Bavli. But one of the things that the Talmud itself points out is that the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Israel Talmud, it's laid out straight with laws. There isn't a lot of argument there. There can be some difference of opinion, but it's opinion, not opinion, but it's usually you get the law of what you're supposed to do and how it's supposed to be. It's clearer in that sense as far as instruction. The Babylonian Talmud is debates and doubling down and then and hair splitting, and it's a lot. First of all, it's a lot more voluminous, and also because we don't have the entire Jerusalem Talmud. But aside from that, it's just so much of the debate, and we kept the debate because the debate was a big part of it. The debate was the struggle, and what the Talmud says, and I remember that I've been mentioning this numerous times, that the struggle that we see in the Babylonian Talmud is the very reason it became the Talmud that persists for posterity, because it wasn't just straight teaching. Oh, this is what I do. Here's the law, no problem. This is kosher. That's not done. The struggle brought more mastery and more clarity as to the subject matter. And I think that's very much on point with this, is that the Jerusalem Talmud would represent more the pure saintly attitude to Torah. That would have been like the first tablets more. And the Jerusalem Talmud is, it's what I mean. I don't understand that. Why is that? Why? And the challenging and the asking, not for the sake of challenging, but for the sake of resolving, noticing, tackling, and resolving any uncertainties or lack of clarity. So those are two poles in what we do as first tablets, second tablets, and we'll finish this going forward. I'm not gonna say we're gonna finish it next week, but we might. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, be well. Wish you all a good week.